Welcome back, dear listener. In the last part of our journey, we explored the origins of the geisha, their beginnings, their early traditions, and the fragile foundations of a world that would soon become timeless. Now, in this new chapter, we step deeper into their story. Together, we will discover how their training grew more rigorous, how their communities formed stronger bonds, and how the floating world began to shape not only entertainment, but the very culture of Japan. So, wherever you are listening from, and whatever time it is for you, make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let us continue our journey into the elegant and mysterious world of the geisha. By the early 19th century, Japan was still under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, but subtle changes were stirring beneath the surface. Commerce continued to expand, cities grew ever larger, and the rhythms of urban life became increasingly complex. Within this context, the geisha had secured her place as a cultural icon. But her profession, like all of society, stood on the threshold of transformation. The world of Edo was entering its twilight, and with it, the floating world itself began to shift. The geisha, however, had a resilience that other figures of the entertainment quarters lacked. Courtesans, weighed down by ritual and expense, began to lose their appeal. The elaborate processions of the oiran, once dazzling spectacles, came to seem outdated, their extravagance ill-suited to a society gradually leaning toward simplicity and efficiency. The geisha, with her understated elegance and adaptable art, found herself increasingly favored. Patrons no longer sought the grandeur of display. They desired the intimacy of presence, the refinement of subtlety, the companionship of wit and laughter. This shift in taste allowed the geisha to step further into the cultural mainstream. No longer confined solely to the licensed quarters, she appeared in a wider variety of contexts. Private banquets, seasonal festivals, even political gatherings. Her role as mediator of atmosphere, curator of refinement, and symbol of impermanence made her presence desirable in settings far beyond the tea houses of Gion or Yoshiwara. At the same time, the rise of print culture spread her image more widely than ever before. Ukiyo prints, inexpensive and popular, carried depictions of geisha into households across Japan. A family in a provincial town might never see a geisha in person, but they could hang a print of her on their wall, admire her elegance, and imagine the world she represented. In this way, the geisha became a symbol not only of the floating world, but of Japan itself. A face that stood for refinement, beauty, and cultural continuity. Yet beneath the surface of this flourishing lay tension. The rigid rules that had once preserved the distinction between geisha and courtesans began to fray at the edges. Some patrons demanded more intimacy than regulations allowed. Some geisha, pressured by debts or opportunity, blurred the boundaries. Authorities responded with fines and restrictions, but enforcement was inconsistent. The very popularity of geisha made them difficult to regulate, and the balance between art and desire grew more precarious. Still, the essence of the profession endured. The geisha was defined not by what she offered physically, but by the world she created through art. Her strength lay in her ability to transform an evening into a memory, to make guests feel they had stepped into a realm where time paused, where beauty and impermanence intertwined. This ability, subtle yet profound, ensured her survival even as other elements of the floating world began to fade. The daily life of the Geisha during this period reflected both continuity and change. Training remained rigorous, with Maiko enduring years of discipline before debuting as full Geisha. The ukiyo continued to structure their lives, managing debts, arranging engagements, enforcing rules. The ozashiki banquets remained the heart of their work, evenings of music, dance, conversation, and games that shaped the memories of patrons. Yet the scope of their presence expanded, as invitations to new kinds of gatherings broadened their influence. Their symbolic weight also grew. In the collective imagination, the geisha became increasingly associated with ideals of national identity. As Japan began to face the pressures of foreign contact, Western ships appearing on the horizon, whispers of change echoing through the cities, the geisha stood as a reminder of tradition, of continuity, of the refined beauty that defined Japanese culture. She was more than an entertainer. She was a cultural guardian, a living emblem of values that many feared might be lost in the tides of change. This symbolic role carried into literature and art of the time. Poets described geisha as blossoms in the night, embodying both the brilliance and the fragility of beauty. Playwrights wove them into stories as figures who balanced joy with melancholy, presence with absence, impermanence with endurance. Painters captured them in quiet moments, adjusting a sleeve, tuning a shamisen, gazing at lantern light, images that spoke less of spectacle and more of the profound simplicity of life. For the geisha themselves, this symbolism was both a blessing and a burden. To be celebrated as icons of culture gave their profession legitimacy and prestige, but it also placed expectations upon them that few could bear easily. Every gesture, every appearance, every evening carried the weight of tradition. They were not simply individuals, but representatives of an entire cultural ideal. Their successes were celebrated widely, their failures judged harshly. And yet, despite these pressures, the geisha endured with resilience. Their adaptability was their greatest strength. Unlike the courtesans, who clung to rituals that no longer resonated, the geisha could adjust to new tastes, new settings, new demands. They preserved their essence, the art of atmosphere, the refinement of presence, even as the world around them shifted. By the time the 19th century moved toward its middle decades, Japan was approaching a crisis of transformation. The arrival of Western powers, the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate, and the onset of modernization would reshape society in ways unimaginable. But before those upheavals began, the geisha of the late Edo period stood as a symbol of balance. They were at once timeless and contemporary, traditional and adaptable, fleeting and enduring. In this moment, the geisha's art reached a peak of refinement. The ozashiki banquets glowed with elegance. The music of shamisen lingered in the night. The laughter of geisha carried through lantern-lit alleys. They were the soul of the floating world, the embodiment of impermanence, the muse of an age poised on the edge of transformation. And though storms of change loomed on the horizon, the geisha were ready. For they had survived by turning boundaries into strengths, by embracing impermanence as beauty, by adapting without losing essence. Theirs was a tradition not of permanence, but of resilience. And in that resilience lay the promise that they would endure, no matter what the future might bring. As the Edo period advanced into its later decades, the geisha stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation. The floating world that had nurtured them was still alive with lantern light, music, and laughter. Yet beyond the gates of the entertainment districts, Japan itself was slowly moving toward profound change. Foreign ships would soon arrive on its shores, and the centuries-old order of the shogunate would tremble. In this atmosphere of anticipation and uncertainty, the geisha came to embody both the fragility of tradition and the resilience of adaptation. Within the confines of Kyoto, Edo, and Osaka, geisha culture remained vibrant. Apprentices still entered ukiyo, passed through the trials of shikomi, blossomed into maiko, and eventually emerged as geisha. The ozashiki banquets continued, filled with shamisen melodies, delicate dances, witty conversation, and playful games. Patrons returned again and again, seeking not possession but presence, not permanence, but the fleeting beauty of a single evening. Yet outside the tatami rooms, whispers of change echoed, whispers of Western ships, of new ideas, of shifts in power that would alter Japan forever. To understand the resilience of the geisha during this time, one must compare their role with that of other women in society. For most women of the Edo period, life was confined to the household. Wives managed domestic duties, daughters prepared for marriage, widows depended on family or community for survival. Education was limited, opportunities few, visibility almost non-existent. Against this backdrop, the geisha appeared as an anomaly. She was visible, trained, accomplished, and, within the boundaries of her art, remarkably independent. She moved between classes, conversed with men of power, and cultivated skills that set her apart from ordinary life. This visibility came with contradictions. On the one hand, the geisha was admired as a symbol of refinement, her presence sought after by men of wealth and status. On the other hand, she was restricted by debts, by the authority of the ukiyo, and by the rules of the pleasure quarters. She lived in a world that celebrated her presence, yet constrained her freedom. This paradox was central to her identity. She was at once empowered and bound, celebrated and confined, a figure of admiration shaped by hardship. The pressures of modernization only sharpened this paradox. As Japan inched closer to opening its doors to the West, questions of national identity grew urgent. What traditions should be preserved? What values define the essence of Japanese culture? In this debate, the geisha emerged as a powerful symbol. To many, she represented the refinement of the nation, a living embodiment of its aesthetic ideals. Her presence in art and literature was not only entertainment, but cultural affirmation. She became a figure through which Japan imagined itself, a symbol of continuity in a time of uncertainty. This symbolic role was reinforced by the arts. Ukiyo-e prints of the period frequently depicted geisha, not as individuals, but as archetypes of elegance. The serene expressions, the flowing sleeves, the subtle gestures, all conveyed ideals of beauty that resonated deeply with Japanese audiences. Writers, too, continued to weave geisha into their stories, often presenting them as figures of wisdom, wit, and melancholy. In these representations, the geisha stood as more than an entertainer. She was a mirror of the age, reflecting both its refinement and its anxieties. Yet the geisha herself was not merely a symbol. She was a living person, navigating the complexities of her profession. Her days were filled with training, performance, and obligation. Her nights were consumed by banquets, laughter, and the careful maintenance of atmosphere. She bore the weight of tradition on her shoulders, even as she faced the uncertainties of debt, the demands of patrons, and the scrutiny of society. Her life was as fragile as the art she embodied, her future as uncertain as the floating world itself. The adaptability of the Geisha was her greatest strength. While other figures of the pleasure quarters declined, unable to adjust to shifting tastes, the Geisha thrived by transforming limitations into virtues. The restrictions on her dress and behavior became markers of refinement. The prohibition against intimacy elevated her into a figure of art. The demands of training gave her a discipline that distinguished her from others. By embracing the very boundaries that constrained her, the Geisha created a unique identity that could endure even as the world changed. This adaptability also allowed Geisha culture to spread geographically. While Kyoto's Gion and Edo's Shinbashi remained the most famous districts, smaller Geisha communities emerged in provincial towns, each with its own variations on the tradition. Local patrons sought to replicate the elegance of the great cities, inviting Geisha to their gatherings, supporting ukiyo, and fostering apprenticeships. Though the scale was smaller, the essence was the same. The creation of atmosphere, the embodiment of refinement, the fleeting beauty of impermanence. The growing visibility of Geisha also shaped Japan's interactions with the outside world. When foreign visitors began to arrive in the mid-19th century, many encountered Geisha as part of their introduction to Japanese culture. To Western eyes, often unfamiliar with the distinctions between courtesans and Geisha, confusion was common. Yet even in misunderstanding, the Geisha's image carried weight. She became, in the eyes of outsiders, a symbol of Japan itself. Enigmatic, refined, delicate, and elusive. This dual role, both national symbol and personal profession, placed enormous pressure on Geisha. They were expected to embody ideals larger than themselves, to serve not only patrons, but culture itself. Their evenings of laughter and song carried meanings that extended far beyond the walls of the tea house, shaping how Japan saw itself and how the world saw Japan. By the eve of modernization, the Geisha had become more than an entertainer. She was an institution, a cultural guardian, a living paradox of freedom and constraint, individuality and tradition. Her art was no longer simply a profession, but a heritage, passed down through generations, refined through repetition, preserved through discipline. And so, as the Edo period prepared to give way to the Meiji era, the Geisha stood ready to face the storms of change. She had survived the restrictions of the Tokugawa shogunate, distinguished herself from courtesans, endured the burdens of debt and discipline, and emerged as a figure of national significance. Her resilience, her adaptability, and her embrace of impermanence ensured that she would not vanish, but endure, transformed yet continuous, into the modern age. By the final decades of the Edo period, the Geisha had become an inseparable part of Japan's cultural landscape. What had begun as a modest shift, from the fading male taikomochi to the rising female entertainers, had blossomed into a profession defined by discipline, refinement, and enduring tradition. The figure of the female geisha was now firmly established. Not a shadow of the courtesan, not merely an accessory of the floating world, but a cultural institution in her own right. The apprenticeship system by this time was deeply entrenched. The journey from shikomi to maiko to geisha had become a rite of passage, marked by rituals, ceremonies, and years of discipline. It was no longer simply training for a profession. It was initiation into a lineage. Each geisha carried within her the traditions of her predecessors, embodying arts that stretched back through generations. In her performance of shamisen, in the tilt of her head during a dance, in the measured cadence of her speech, centuries of refinement were present. The ukiyo, too, had evolved into institutions of cultural preservation. These houses were not merely places of residence and financial management. They were schools of art, repositories of tradition, guardians of continuity. The okasan, once simply a manager, now stood as a custodian of heritage, ensuring that each generation of geisha upheld the standards of grace and discipline. In this way, the ukiyo became more than homes. They were pillars of cultural identity. The ozashiki banquets reflected this maturation. What had once been informal gatherings now carried the weight of tradition, shaped by customs that had become deeply ingrained. The presence of geisha elevated these evenings into ceremonies of refinement, where music, dance, and conversation flowed seamlessly into one another. Guests spoke of these banquets not only as entertainment, but as experiences of culture, as glimpses into the very soul of Japanese aesthetics. By the mid-19th century, the distinction between geisha and courtesans was absolute. The courtesans, though still present, were increasingly marginalized. Their elaborate rituals, once marks of prestige, seemed outdated in a society shifting towards subtlety and simplicity. Geisha, with their restraint and adaptability, came to represent the essence of refinement. Their influence grew even as the courtesans declined, and by the end of the Edo period, it was clear that the geisha, not the courtesan, would carry the legacy of the floating world into the future. This ascendancy carried symbolic significance. The geisha had become a vessel for values deeply embedded in Japanese thought: impermanence, subtlety, suggestion, and grace. She was a living embodiment of mono no aware, the awareness that beauty lies in transience, that moments are precious precisely because they cannot last. Each evening with a geisha was a performance of impermanence, a fleeting glimpse of eternity contained within laughter, music, and dance. Her symbolic weight extended beyond the entertainment districts. Geisha appeared in woodblock prints that circulated widely, in poems recited in salons, in plays that drew audiences across the cities. They became cultural icons, their images shaping the perception of beauty not only within Japan, but increasingly abroad. To foreigners who began to encounter Japan in the mid-19th century, the geisha appeared as a mysterious yet definitive representation of the nation itself. Delicate, refined, elusive, and timeless. Yet beneath this symbolic presence, the lives of geisha remained bound by discipline and hardship. Debts to the ukiyo persisted, obligations to patrons remained complex, the demands of training consumed their days. The serenity seen by patrons was sustained by labor unseen, by sacrifices unacknowledged, by discipline relentless in its demands. The paradox endured. The geisha was celebrated for her elegance, yet that elegance was built upon struggle. Still, it was precisely this paradox that gave the geisha her resilience. By embracing constraint, she found freedom. By embodying impermanence, she achieved endurance. By cultivating subtlety, she secured prominence. Other professions of the floating world faded, unable to adapt to changing times. The geisha survived, not by resisting change, but by absorbing it, by turning its forces into opportunities for refinement. As the Edo period drew to a close and the Meiji era approached, the geisha stood ready to face a new world. The shogunate would fall, Japan would open its doors to the West, modernization would sweep through society with unprecedented force. Many traditions would collapse under the weight of these transformations. Yet the geisha, paradoxically, would endure. She had been born of adaptation, shaped by paradox, sustained by impermanence. And it was these very qualities that would allow her to navigate the storms of modernity. The birth of the female geisha was thus not merely the emergence of a profession. It was the creation of an institution, a cultural symbol, a living embodiment of Japan's deepest values. She had risen from the shadows of courtesans and male entertainers to become the face of refinement, the guardian of tradition, the muse of impermanence. Her journey was one of hardship and beauty, of discipline and freedom, of fragility and resilience. And so, as lanterns glowed in the alleys of Kyoto's Gion, as shamisen strings echoed through the tea houses of Edo, as laughter drifted into the night air, the geisha of the late Edo period stood as a promise that art could endure even in the face of change, that beauty could survive even in the midst of impermanence, that tradition could adapt without losing essence. She was the flower in bloom, the song in silence, the fleeting moment that lingers forever in memory. The story of her birth was complete. The story of her endurance was only just beginning. The 19th century ushered in what many consider the golden age of the geisha. By this time, their identity was secure, their traditions codified, and their presence deeply ingrained in the cultural life of Japan. The courtesans, once dominant, had begun their long decline, leaving the geisha as the primary figures of refinement within the floating world. In the alleys of Kyoto's Gion, the streets of Edo's Shinbashi, and the tea houses of Osaka, the geisha reigned as artists of presence, custodians of elegance, and muses of impermanence. This period was marked by both continuity and transformation. The structures of apprenticeship, the discipline of the ukiyo, the rituals of the ozashiki, all remained intact, sustaining the traditions that had defined the profession for over a century. Yet the scope of the geisha's influence expanded, reaching far beyond the confines of the entertainment districts. She became not only a figure of leisure, but a participant in the cultural, artistic, and even political currents of her time. In Kyoto, the geisha of Gion achieved particular renown. Their training was rigorous, their standards exacting, their performances infused with an elegance that made them the envy of other districts. Gion became synonymous with refinement, its narrow lanes glowing with lanterns, its tea houses alive with music and laughter. To be invited into this world was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and well-connected, a mark of status as much as of taste. The geisha of Gion, in turn, became arbiters of culture, their approval and presence conferring prestige upon their patrons. Edo, too, saw the flourishing of geisha culture. In the district of Shinbashi, geisha entertained merchants, samurai, and officials, their presence shaping the rhythms of urban life. Unlike the courtesans of Yoshiwara, whose appeal had waned, the geisha of Shinbashi thrived by emphasizing art over indulgence, conversation over ritual, refinement over spectacle. Their adaptability allowed them to meet the changing tastes of a society increasingly oriented towards subtlety and restraint. The arts themselves reached new heights of refinement during this golden age. The shamisen, long associated with geisha performance, evolved into a vehicle for complex and sophisticated compositions. Dances became more elaborate, yet always restrained by the elegance that defined the profession. Songs carried themes of love, loss, and impermanence, echoing the deeper currents of Japanese philosophy. Poetry and conversation intertwined with performance, creating evenings that were as intellectually stimulating as they were emotionally captivating. The geisha's influence also extended into the broader cultural imagination. Ukiyo-e artists continued to depict them, their images circulating widely and shaping popular perceptions of beauty. Writers included them in stories that explored themes of impermanence and refinement. Even political leaders found value in their company, for the presence of geisha at gatherings could soften tensions, foster camaraderie, and create atmospheres conducive to negotiation. This intersection with politics was subtle but significant. Geisha were not politicians, nor were they directly involved in matters of state. Yet their role as mediators of atmosphere gave them influence in contexts where mood and perception were crucial. A banquet with geisha could turn a tense negotiation into a convivial gathering, easing communication between rivals. Their laughter and music provided the backdrop against which decisions were made, their presence lending an air of refinement to even the most pragmatic discussions. The resilience of geisha during this period was further demonstrated by their ability to adapt to modernization. As Western influences began to seep into Japanese society, geisha incorporated elements of novelty without abandoning tradition. They remained faithful to the arts of shamisen, dance, and tea ceremony. Yet they also engaged with new forms of entertainment, subtly weaving change into continuity. This adaptability ensured their survival even as the world around them shifted. For the guests who attended ozashiki banquets during this golden age, the experience was unforgettable. To sit in a tatami room, the glow of lanterns casting shadows on painted screens, the sound of shamisen rising into the night, the laughter of geisha filling the air. This was to step into a world apart from ordinary life. The burdens of duty and hierarchy melted away, replaced by the fleeting joy of art and companionship. Each evening was unique, each moment irretrievable, each memory tinged with the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. This was the essence of the golden age of geisha, a time when their art flourished, their influence expanded, and their presence defined the culture of an era. They were no longer merely entertainers of the floating world. They were its guardians, its muses, its enduring symbols of beauty and refinement. The golden age of the geisha was not only measured in the brilliance of their public image, but also in the rhythms of their daily lives. To glimpse their world in this period is to step behind the paper screens of the tea houses, into the tatami rooms where music, laughter, and elegance shaped evenings that patrons would remember for a lifetime. Yet beyond the banquets and festivals lay the demanding routines that sustain this world. Routines marked by discipline, artistry, and ceaseless preparation. A geisha's day began long before her evening performances. In the morning hours, while much of the city was still stirring, she and her maiko apprentices were already at work. Lessons in music and dance occupied the early part of the day. The shamisen, with its 3 taut strings, required endless practice to master. Its notes capable of expressing both joy and sorrow. Teachers demanded precision, correcting posture, timing, and intonation until the instrument became an extension of the body itself. Dance lessons followed, each movement carefully studied. An elegant turn of the wrist, a measured step across the tatami, the slow unfurling of a fan. These gestures were not simply physical motions, but a language of grace, carrying meanings that guests were trained to notice and appreciate. After lessons, there were rehearsals for songs and games, practice in poetry and conversation, and for the maiko, lessons in proper etiquette. How to bow, how to pour sake, how to enter a room with serenity, all were part of the training. Even calligraphy was included. For a geisha's handwriting was seen as a reflection of her refinement. By midday, the women would pause for a simple meal before resuming preparations for the evening ahead. The hours before dusk were dedicated to dressing. A geisha's kimono was no simple garment. It required assistance to don properly, its folds and sashes arranged with careful precision. The choice of fabric reflected season, occasion, and status. Subdued patterns for quiet gatherings, more elaborate motifs for festivals or special events. The obi, the wide sash tied at the back, was both a practical and aesthetic centerpiece, demanding skill to secure in elegant knots. Hair was arranged by specialists, each style signaling stage of life and apprenticeship, adorned with ornaments that shifted with the calendar months. Makeup, too, was an art. The pale white base applied evenly, the eyebrows drawn with care, the lips painted in subtle curves that highlighted refinement rather than excess. When evening fell, the geisha left her ukiyo for the ochaya tea house, where the ozashiki banquet would take place. The streets glowed with lanterns, their light reflecting on the wet cobblestones. The air filled with the distant sound of shamisen strings drifting from other tea houses. Guests would already be arriving, greeted by hosts who ensured that every detail of the evening was perfect. The geisha entered quietly, bowing with grace, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Conversation stilled for a moment, then resumed with new vitality. Her presence like a flame that drew all eyes. The structure of an ozashiki was fluid, shaped by the moods of the guests and the intuition of the geisha. At first, she might sit and pour sake, engaging in light conversation, offering witty remarks that dissolved stiffness and drew laughter. A maiko might accompany her, serving with youthful exuberance, her bright kimono a vibrant contrast to the geisha's subdued elegance. The interplay between them, youthful promise and mature refinement, created a harmony that captivated guests. As the evening progressed, the arts unfolded. The shamisen was lifted, its notes rising into the room with both liveliness and melancholy. Songs followed, often themed to the season: cherry blossoms in spring, fireflies in summer, autumn leaves drifting, snow falling in winter. Each lyric carried echoes of impermanence, reminding guests that beauty exists only in its passing. Dances, too, were performed, with fans, umbrellas, or simple gestures of the body. The movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with suggestion. Each one a poem written in silence. Games broke the formality, drawing guests into playful competition. Drinking chants, hand-clapping challenges, and rhythm games filled the room with laughter. The geisha guided these activities with skill, ensuring that everyone participated, No one felt excluded, and the atmosphere remained joyful. These games were more than amusement. They were tools of social harmony, dissolving barriers of rank and status, creating a shared experience that bound the group together. Conversation wove through the evening like an invisible thread. A geisha's wit was as important as her dance, her ability to turn a phrase as valued as her ability to pluck a string. She listened attentively, responded with grace, offered insights that surprised, and teased with humor that delighted. Guests left not only with memories of music and movement, but with words that lingered in their minds, phrases that seemed to echo long after the lanterns had been extinguished. For the geisha, these evenings were both performance and livelihood. Each engagement brought income, reducing debts to the ukiyo, building reputation, attracting patrons. Success was measured not only in money, but in prestige, in the number of invitations received, in the admiration whispered through the alleys of the district. A celebrated geisha could command respect across the city, her presence sought by the most influential men of the time. Yet the demands were relentless. Nights often stretched late into the darkness, leaving little time for rest before lessons resumed the next morning. The financial burdens remained heavy, the debts to the ukiyo consuming much of the earnings. The elegance seen by guests was built upon sacrifice, discipline, and exhaustion. The serenity of the geisha's smile concealed the rigor of her life, the grace of her performance veiling the hardships beneath. Still, it was in this very balance of hardship and beauty that the geisha's art found its depth. Her refinement was not effortless, but earned, not natural, but cultivated. Guests sensed, even if they could not articulate, that the elegance before them was the product of years of training, of struggles overcome, of discipline turned into art. This awareness deepened the appreciation of her presence, making the fleeting moments of the ozashiki all the more precious. The golden age of the geisha was, above all, a time when this delicate balance was perfected. The traditions of training, the structures of the ukiyo, the rituals of the ozashiki, all combined to create evenings that were both ephemeral and eternal. Patrons experienced joy that faded with the night, yet lingered forever in memory. Geisha carried burdens unseen, yet offered beauty undiminished. Together, they created a world that has endured in imagination long after the lanterns of the floating world were extinguished. The 19th century was a period of both flourishing tradition and mounting transformation. For the geisha, this was the moment when their image reached its widest recognition, not only in the floating world of the entertainment districts, but across the cultural imagination of Japan. The geisha became more than entertainers. They became symbols, icons of refinement, embodiments of the nation's aesthetic ideals, and muses for artists, poets, and playwrights. One of the clearest signs of this elevation was their frequent appearance in ukiyo-e woodblock prints. By the 1800s, prints of geisha adorned homes across Japan, from the grand residences of merchants to the humbler abodes of artisans. Artists depicted them not merely as individuals, but as archetypes of beauty and grace. A print might show a geisha adjusting her sleeve, playing the shamisen, or gazing out at falling snow. These quiet moments carried immense resonance, suggesting entire worlds of meaning in the curve of a wrist or the angle of a gaze. In these prints, the geisha was often contrasted with the oiran, courtesan, where the courtesan was depicted in towering finery, Surrounded by attendants, the geisha was shown in moments of intimacy and subtlety. She embodied suggestion rather than spectacle, refinement rather than display. This visual distinction reinforced the cultural divide that had long separated their roles, establishing the geisha as the true inheritor of the floating world's aesthetic values. Literature, too, embraced the geisha. Novelists and poets described evenings in their company, capturing the bittersweet mixture of joy and impermanence that defined the ozashiki. Poems spoke of lantern light reflected on sake cups, of shamisen strings vibrating in the silence of night, of laughter that lingered like perfume long after it had faded. These writings did not simply record experiences. They elevated them, presenting the geisha as figures who embodied the essence of Muno no Aware, the poignant awareness of transience that lay at the heart of Japanese philosophy. Kabuki theater, already a flourishing art form, also found inspiration in geisha culture. Plays often included characters modeled on geisha, their presence lending authenticity and elegance to the stage. Audiences recognized in these portrayals not only the charm of the floating world, but also the values of refinement and impermanence. In this way, the geisha entered the popular imagination through multiple avenues, reinforcing their role as cultural symbols. Beyond the arts, the geisha's influence seeped into broader social life. Their reputation as arbiters of taste made their approval valuable to patrons. A merchant might enhance his prestige by being seen in the company of celebrated geisha, his wealth transformed into cultural refinement through their association. Samurai, too, sought their companionship, finding in their presence a respite from the rigid codes of duty. Even scholars and poets admired them, valuing their ability to blend intellect with artistry, conversation with performance. This cultural prominence elevated the geisha into a kind of unofficial ambassador of Japanese aesthetics. As foreign influence loomed on the horizon, many Japanese saw in the geisha a figure who embodied the values they feared might be threatened: restraint, elegance, harmony, and impermanence. To preserve the geisha was to preserve something essential about Japan itself, a sense of identity rooted not in power or conquest, but in beauty and refinement. Yet this symbolic role carried with it burdens. The idealized image of the geisha often obscured the realities of her life. The debts, the discipline, the exhaustion of endless training, all were hidden behind the serene smile and graceful gestures. Artists depicted elegance, not struggle. Writers celebrated beauty, not hardship. The public saw symbols, not individuals. And so the geisha lived in a paradox, at once elevated as cultural icons and constrained by the harsh demands of their profession. Still, many geisha embraced this paradox, finding in it both challenge and opportunity. To be a geisha in the 19th century was to carry the weight of tradition, to embody ideals larger than oneself, to serve as both entertainer and cultural guardian. Their presence reminded Japan of its own values at a time when the outside world was beginning to press against its shores. This blending of personal presence and cultural symbolism was perhaps most evident in festivals and seasonal events. Geisha often appeared in public celebrations, their dances and songs adding refinement to occasions that brought entire communities together. In these moments, they were not hidden within tea houses, but visible to all, their presence reinforcing the link between art, community, and tradition. For many ordinary Japanese, glimpsing a geisha at a festival was their only direct encounter with this world of refinement, a brief but memorable experience that lingered in memory. The golden age of geisha was thus not only about the brilliance of private banquets, but also about the broadening of their cultural influence. They became part of the shared imagination of Japan, figures whose elegance spoke to values cherished across society. Their art was no longer confined to the floating world. It had become a symbol of the nation itself. As the century advanced, this symbolic role would only grow more important. The arrival of Western powers, the fall of the shogunate, and the rapid modernization of the Meiji era would place immense pressure on tradition. Many aspects of the floating world would vanish. But the geisha, paradoxically, would endure, because they had become more than entertainers. They had become symbols of identity, resilience, and impermanence. The golden age of geisha was not confined to the quiet glow of lantern-lit tea houses or the cobblestone alleys of Kyoto and Edo. Their influence extended far into the realms of politics and power, where the art of atmosphere they had mastered became a subtle yet significant force. In the rigid world of Tokugawa Japan, where negotiations were delicate and hierarchies unforgiving, the presence of geisha often served as a balm, softening tensions and opening paths to understanding that might otherwise have remained closed. Political banquets were not uncommon in the 19th century. Daimyo, merchants, and officials gathered to forge alliances, to discuss matters of commerce, or to resolve disputes. These occasions were fraught with potential conflict, for pride and power sat heavily at the table. Yet when geisha were invited, the atmosphere shifted. Their laughter eased the sharp edges of formality. Their music filled the silences that might have become uncomfortable. Their conversation provided bridges between rivals. In this way, geisha acted as mediators, not by addressing politics directly, but by shaping the emotional landscape in which politics unfolded. This role was never written into law, nor formally acknowledged. Yet it was deeply understood by those who participated in such gatherings. A samurai might lay aside his stern demeanor in the presence of a geisha's playful banter. A merchant might find common ground with a nobleman while sharing in the same game of sake cups guided by her hand. In a society defined by rigid boundaries, the geisha created temporary spaces of equality, where status receded and humanity shone through. Their presence in political contexts was also symbolic. A host who invited geisha signaled not only wealth, but refinement. To provide guests with the company of geisha was to demonstrate cultural sophistication, to show that one valued beauty and tradition as much as power and profit. This symbolism extended into diplomacy. For foreign envoys who began to arrive in Japan during the 19th century, often encountered geisha as part of their introduction to Japanese culture. To them, the geisha appeared as an emblem of the nation itself. Delicate, refined, enigmatic, and deeply tied to tradition. The subtle power of the geisha lay precisely in this symbolism. They were not rulers, nor policymakers, nor warriors. Yet their presence shaped the contexts in which decisions were made, the moods in which alliances were formed, the atmospheres in which conflicts were resolved. Their influence was indirect, but it was real, woven into the very fabric of the social and political life of the time. This influence was reinforced by the patronage system. Many geishas secured dana among the political and economic elite. These patrons provided financial support, easing the burdens of debt and securing the geisha's independence from her ukiyo. In return, the patron gained not only companionship but prestige. To be associated with a celebrated geisha was to display refinement, to align oneself with the values of culture and elegance. Such relationships often placed geisha in proximity to the currents of power, granting them insights and influence unavailable to most women of their era. Some geisha became confidants of powerful men, their conversations extending beyond art and amusement into matters of strategy, philosophy, and vision. They listened, advised, and inspired, their presence shaping thoughts that would ripple outward into decisions affecting society at large. These roles were rarely acknowledged publicly, for geisha were not seen as political figures. Yet history is filled with moments where the invisible influences of atmosphere, companionship, and inspiration proved as decisive as overt acts of governance. The ability of geisha to navigate these spheres rested on their mastery of subtlety. They knew how to say enough to spark thought, yet not so much as to overstep boundaries. They could draw a man into laughter at the moment tension threatened to harden, or offer a song that reminded all present of the fleeting nature of conflict itself. Their art was not only in music or dance, but in timing, intuition, and the delicate balancing of moods. This subtle art was rooted in the very philosophy that underpinned geisha culture: impermanence. Just as their performances were fleeting, so too were the conflicts and disputes of men. In creating spaces of joy and beauty, they reminded their guests that life was more than power and ambition. Their presence whispered of transience, of the futility of clinging too tightly to pride, of the possibility of harmony in the midst of discord. The golden age of geisha thus reveals not only their role as entertainers, but their place as quiet agents of social and political cohesion. They were the oil in the machinery of a rigid society, ensuring that friction did not spark into flame, that encounters ended in camaraderie rather than conflict. Their contribution cannot be measured in laws passed or battles won, but in the countless evenings where laughter prevailed over anger, music over silence, harmony over division. To the outside world, this influence appeared mysterious. Foreign visitors who attended banquets with geisha often wrote of their astonishment at the atmosphere created, describing evenings where barriers dissolved, where art and conversation blended seamlessly, where the presence of these women transformed gatherings into unforgettable experiences. For many of these outsiders, the geisha became the defining image of Japan itself, shaping perceptions that would endure for generations. It is in this blending of art, culture, and subtle influence that the true power of the geisha during their golden age can be found. They did not wield authority, yet they shaped it. They did not rule, yet they guided rulers. They did not fight, yet they soothed the aftermath of conflict. Their art was not merely for pleasure, but for harmony. And in a time when Japan stood on the brink of transformation, this art proved more valuable than ever. To understand the geisha in her golden age, one must look not only at her public image, her banquets, or her symbolic role in culture and politics, but also at the rhythms of her private world. Behind the elegant poise, behind the shamisen strings and the quiet laughter, lay lives of women bound together in houses of discipline and sisterhood, shaped by debts, duty, and moments of fragile intimacy. The ukiyo, the geisha house, was at the center of this private life. Each ukiyo functioned as both home and institution, a place where young girls entered as shikomi, grew into maiko, and eventually emerged as geisha. It was ruled by the okasan, the mother, whose authority extended into every aspect of the women's lives. She managed finances, arranged engagements, enforced rules, and ensured that the reputation of the house was maintained. For many geisha, the okasan was a complex figure, part guardian, part disciplinarian, part business manager. She could be nurturing or harsh, supportive or demanding, but always central. Within the ukiyo, relationships among the women themselves were equally complex. Bonds of sisterhood formed between geisha and maiko, particularly through the formal system of mentorship. The onisan, or older sister, guided her imauto, or younger sister, through the trials of apprenticeship. This relationship was more than instructional. It was emotional, shaping the young maiko's sense of identity and belonging. Ceremonies marked the bond, and names were often shared, creating a lineage of artistry that extended across generations. Yet sisterhood did not always mean harmony. Competition was ever present, for reputation determined not only prestige but livelihood. A geisha who won the favor of patrons could secure invitations, wealth, and independence. Others, less successful, might struggle in obscurity, burdened by debt and limited opportunity. Jealousy simmered, rivalries flared, and the atmosphere of the ukiyo could shift between solidarity and tension. Still, the shared discipline, the shared burdens, and the shared identity as geisha bound the women together more strongly than it divided them. Life in the ukiyo was regimented. Mornings began with chores and lessons, evenings with preparation for banquets, nights with performances that often stretched late into the darkness. Rest was limited, leisure rare. Even moments of relaxation were often consumed by practice, as shamisen strings were plucked in quiet rooms, or dance steps rehearsed before small mirrors. The weight of expectation pressed constantly, for each woman carried not only her own reputation, but that of her house. Outside the ukiyo, personal lives were equally constrained. Marriage was generally forbidden, for a geisha's role was incompatible with domestic duties. Some found companionship in the form of dana patrons, relationships that varied from financial arrangements to deep emotional bonds. Others formed attachments more discreetly, risking punishment if discovered. For many, the demands of their profession left little room for private life, and their identities became inseparable from their art. Yet within these constraints, moments of intimacy and humanity flourished. Geisha shared laughter and secrets in the quiet hours after banquets, supported one another through illness and fatigue, celebrated milestones of apprenticeship and debut. They marked the seasons with small rituals: cherry blossoms in spring, fireflies in summer, moon viewing in autumn, snow in winter, finding in these cycles a rhythm that mirrored their own fleeting careers. The personal sacrifices were immense. Families often sent daughters into the ukiyo out of necessity, driven by poverty or debt. For some women, the geisha's path offered opportunity otherwise unimaginable: education, visibility, influence, and the chance to move among circles of power. For others, it meant years of struggle, burdened by obligations that never fully lifted. Success and hardship existed side by side, inseparable within the same world. Despite the challenges, many geisha took pride in their identity. To be a geisha was to embody refinement, to preserve traditions, to carry forward a lineage of artistry. They saw themselves not as victims of circumstance, but as custodians of culture. Women who gave their lives to the pursuit of beauty. This pride was reinforced by the admiration they received from patrons, artists, and the broader public, who celebrated them as icons of elegance. The duality of their lives, public elegance and private hardship, added depth to their art. Guests sensed, even if they did not know the details, that the grace before them was hard-won, that the serenity of a geisha's smile concealed struggles unseen. This awareness deepened the poignancy of their presence, making each evening more precious, each performance more profound. The geisha embodied impermanence not only in philosophy, but in her own life, her beauty and influence shining brightly, then fading as youth gave way to age. For the women themselves, this impermanence was both a sorrow and a truth embraced. They knew their careers would be short, their time in the spotlight fleeting. Yet this very transience gave meaning to their efforts, urgency to their training, and depth to their performances. Like the cherry blossoms they so often celebrated in song and dance, their lives were brief but brilliant. Their legacy carried in memory rather than permanence. The golden age of geisha was thus not only about banquets, politics, and art. It was also about the lives of women who lived within the ukiyo, who carried the burdens of debt and discipline, who found sisterhood amid rivalry, who created beauty in the face of impermanence. Their private world was inseparable from their public presence, each shaping the other, each giving depth and authenticity to the refinement that patrons so admired. In this balance of public and private, of elegance and hardship, the geisha revealed her true strength. She was not only an artist of atmosphere, but an artist of endurance, her life itself a performance of resilience. And it was this resilience, as much as her beauty, that ensured her survival in an age of both tradition and transformation. While the world of this geisha was most often associated with the quiet intimacy of ozashiki banquets, their presence was not confined to closed rooms. During the 19th century, geisha stepped into the broader life of cities and towns, taking part in festivals, seasonal celebrations, and public ceremonies. These appearances revealed another dimension of their role. They were not only private entertainers, but also public symbols, embodiments of refinement who represented the spirit of their communities. Kyoto's Gion district, long considered the spiritual heart of geisha culture, was especially famous for such appearances. The Gion Matsuri, one of Japan's grandest festivals, brought processions of floats, music, and crowds into the city each summer. While the festival itself was rooted in Shinto tradition, geisha often participated in the surrounding celebrations, hosting gatherings, performing dances, and lending their presence to the festivities. To glimpse a maiko in her elaborate attire, walking among the lanterns of the festival, was to feel the intertwining of sacred tradition and artistic refinement. Other festivals throughout Japan likewise included appearances by geisha. Seasonal events such as cherry blossom viewing in spring or moon viewing in autumn offered opportunities for geisha to perform outdoors, bringing their songs and dances into spaces where the broader public could witness their art. These moments were treasured by ordinary townspeople, many of whom would never be invited to a private ozashiki. A fleeting encounter with a geisha at a festival could become a cherished memory, a story told for years afterward. Public performances highlighted the adaptability of geisha culture. While their art was most refined in the controlled setting of the tea house, geisha were skilled in adjusting their presence to the energy of crowds. Their dances could be expanded for larger audiences, their music amplified by multiple shamisen played together, their attire chosen to dazzle under lantern light. These adjustments never abandoned refinement. They simply translated it into a more public key, demonstrating that elegance could flourish even amid the noise and bustle of festival life. Such public appearances also reinforced the legitimacy of the geisha as cultural custodians. When they danced at festivals, they connected their art to the rhythms of community life. They were not only entertainers for the wealthy, but participants in traditions shared by all. Their presence signaled continuity between the floating world and the broader society, weaving the ephemeral beauty of their art into the enduring cycles of seasonal celebration. For many townspeople, these glimpses carried profound meaning. The geisha embodied a refinement that most could not access directly. Yet her appearance in public festivals offered a sense of inclusion, a taste of beauty that transcended class. Children watched in awe. Women admired the grace of kimono and hairstyle. Men marveled at the combination of charm and discipline. In this way, the geisha became not only a symbol for elites, but a shared cultural figure, recognized across the spectrum of society. The symbolism of these public roles was often captured in art. Woodblock prints depicted geisha at festivals, their figures framed by lanterns, cherry blossoms, or autumn leaves. Writers described them in essays and poems, evoking the joy of seeing refinement woven into the fabric of community life. These depictions reinforced the idea that the geisha were not isolated figures of luxury, but participants in the collective identity of Japan. Seasonal rituals gave further depth to their role. Geisha marked the turning of the year with dances and songs tied to specific festivals. In New Year's celebrations, they performed pieces that evoked renewal and prosperity. During Setsubun, the festival marking the division between winter and spring, they took part in rituals to drive away misfortune, their laughter blending with chants of good fortune. Each season carried its traditions, and geisha aligned their art with these rhythms, embodying the impermanence and renewal that defined Japanese cultural life. The participation of geisha in festivals also served practical purposes. Public performances offered opportunities to attract new patrons, to build reputation, to display talents beyond the intimate circle of existing clients. For younger Maiko, festival appearances were especially valuable, allowing them to showcase their training to a wider audience and to step into the public eye as budding artists. A single performance at a well-attended festival could launch a career, securing invitations to ozashiki and earning admiration that translated into patronage. Yet, even in public settings, the geisha maintained the careful balance of their profession. They did not compete with actors or courtesans, nor did they present themselves as mere entertainers for the masses. Their performances remained grounded in refinement, their gestures restrained, their music imbued with the subtlety that defined their art. This restraint distinguished them, ensuring that their identity as geisha remained intact even as they adapted to new contexts. For the people of 19th century Japan, the presence of geisha at festivals symbolized something larger than entertainment. They represented the intersection of tradition and impermanence, of community and refinement, of everyday life and transcendent beauty. In their dances under cherry blossoms, in their songs beneath the harvest moon, in their laughter among lanterns, the geisha embodied the essence of a culture that found eternity in the fleeting. Thus, the golden age of the geisha was not confined to private rooms or elite circles. It lived in the streets, in the festivals, in the rhythms of community life. The geisha walked among the people, reminding them that beauty was not only for the privileged, but for all who paused to see, to hear, to remember. In this, they became more than entertainers, more than cultural custodians. They became the living symbols of a nation that found its soul in the harmony of art and impermanence. Behind the shimmering elegance of the geisha's art, behind the laughter of ozashiki banquets and the grace of festival dances, lay an unrelenting economic reality. To be a geisha in the 19th century was not only to embody refinement, but to navigate a world shaped by debt, obligation, and financial negotiation. The golden age of the geisha was as much about economics as it was about beauty. For every note of shamisen, every fold of kimono, every gesture of grace was sustained by systems of money and patronage. At the center of this economic world stood the ukiyo. The geisha house was not merely a home, but a financial institution, managing the debts and earnings of its women with precision. When a girl entered as a shikomi, the ukiyo bore the costs of her training: lessons in music, dance, tea ceremony, and calligraphy, fees for instructors, expenses for kimono and accessories, and the daily costs of food and lodging. These expenditures quickly accumulated, creating debts that the apprentice was expected to repay once she began earning as a maiko, and later as a geisha. The debts were not symbolic. They were binding contracts. Every engagement, every banquet, every performance contributed not only to the geisha's reputation, but to the repayment of what she owed. For many women, these debts were immense, stretching across years, sometimes decades. A successful career could lead to eventual independence, but for others, the burden remained a lifelong tether to the ukiyo. Kimono represented one of the most significant expenses. A geisha's appearance was central to her art, and her attire had to reflect refinement, seasonality, and occasion. Each kimono could cost a small fortune, particularly those made of silk with intricate embroidery or hand-painted designs. The obi, the wide sash, was itself an object of expense and artistry, requiring skill to tie and often serving as the focal point of the outfit. Hairstyles demanded costly ornaments, each piece selected with care to reflect the season. Cherry blossoms in spring, maple leaves in autumn, cranes in winter. Even makeup, with its distinctive white base and red accents, required specialized products and the skill of attendants. The ukiyo covered these costs, adding them to the ledger of debts. Thus, every evening spent in an ozashiki was not only performance, but repayment. Every invitation an opportunity to reduce the burden. The elegance that guests admired so easily was sustained by financial systems invisible to them, by the constant calculation of debts and earnings that underpin the geisha's life. Patronage offered one path toward relief. The dana, or patron, played a central role in the economic structure of geisha culture. Typically a wealthy merchant, nobleman, or official, the dana provided financial support to a geisha. covering the costs of her attire, lessons, and even her debts to the ukiyo. In return, he received exclusivity of companionship, though the nature of this companionship varied widely. Some relationships remained centered on art and presence, while others became more personal. The role of the dana was complex. For the geisha, a patron could mean freedom from the crushing weight of debt, independence from the strict oversight of the ukiyo, and the ability to focus more fully on her art. For the patron, the relationship offered not only companionship, but prestige. To be associated with a celebrated geisha was to demonstrate refinement, to display wealth transformed into culture, to signal participation in the highest circles of elegance. Yet these arrangements carried risks. A geisha dependent on a single patron risked losing independence if the relationship soured or ended. A patron, too, could fall from wealth or power, leaving the geisha once again burdened by debt. Navigating these relationships required skill, intuition, and an ability to balance intimacy with independence. Many geisha became adept at managing multiple forms of support, blending patronage with earnings from performances to secure stability. The economics of the seisha extended beyond individual arrangements into the broader society. The floating world itself was a vast network of commerce, sustained by merchants, artisans, and laborers who provided the goods and services that made banquets possible. Kimono makers, shamisen craftsmen, hairstylists, and tea-house proprietors all profited from the presence of geisha. In this way, geisha were not only artists, but engines of economic activity, their performances fueling entire industries of refinement. Even the festivals where geisha appeared carried economic significance. Crowds gathered, tea-houses flourished, artisans sold their wares, and the presence of geisha elevated the value of the event. Their role in these contexts underscored the extent to which they were embedded not only in cultural life, but in the financial lifeblood of the city. The financial burdens of geisha life shaped their personal choices. Many remained unmarried, for marriage often meant leaving the profession and forfeiting the investments made in their training. Others relied on the stability of patrons to secure a measure of independence. Some achieved great wealth and freedom, becoming legends within their districts, their names remembered for generations. Others struggled in obscurity, their debts never fully repaid, their lives consumed by the invisible weight of financial obligation. And yet, within these challenges, there was pride. To succeed as a geisha was to demonstrate not only artistic refinement, but resilience, discipline, and skill in navigating the economic complexities of the floating world. Guests might see only the elegance of performance, but beneath it lay a mastery of survival, a strength forged in the crucible of debt and discipline. The golden age of geisha was thus not only a time of beauty, but of economics. The shimmering sleeves, the haunting notes of shamisen, the graceful dances, all were sustained by systems of money and obligation, by patrons and debts, by the invisible labor of ukiyo and artisans. The geisha stood at the center of this web, both artist and economic actor, both symbol of refinement and participant in commerce. It is this dual role, embodiment of impermanence yet rooted in the realities of finance, that reveals the true depth of the geisha's world. She was at once a fleeting blossom and a practical survivor, a figure of beauty sustained by the unyielding structures of economy. Her golden age was not only one of art, but of resilience, a testament to the power of adaptation in the face of constraint. The art of the Geisha reached its fullest flowering during the Golden Age. In these decades, the disciplines of music, dance, poetry, and ritual were refined into a living tapestry of elegance, each thread carefully cultivated, each gesture imbued with meaning. To witness a geisha's performance in this period was to encounter not merely entertainment, but a profound expression of cultural values. Refinement, impermanence, harmony, and grace. Music was at the heart of the geisha's art. The shamisen, with its 3 strings stretched across a skin-covered body, produced tones that were at once haunting and playful, capable of echoing sorrow or sparking laughter. A skilled geisha could shift the mood of an entire room with a single melody, plucking strings that seemed to vibrate not only in the air, but in the hearts of her listeners. Pieces ranged from light-hearted songs meant for drinking games to deeply moving ballads that carried themes of love, loss, and the changing seasons. The shamisen was often accompanied by singing, and the voice of a geisha carried a unique quality. It was not the powerful projection of an opera singer, nor the polished clarity of a court musician. Rather, it was intimate, filled with subtle inflections designed not for vast audiences, but for the small, enclosed spaces of tea houses. A single note, held with trembling precision, could evoke tears. A playful lyric, sung with a half-smile, could fill the room with laughter. The songs themselves often celebrated impermanence. Cherry blossoms falling, snow melting, fireflies glowing briefly in the night. Each lyric was a reminder of the fleeting nature of beauty, of the poignancy that lay in transience. Dance, too, was central to geisha artistry. Performed in the confined space of a tatami room, the dances were not about grand gestures, but about precision, restraint, and suggestion. A flick of the wrist, the slow turn of the body, the sweep of a sleeve. Each carried meaning, each spoke in the silent language of elegance. Props such as fans, parasol, or small bells were used sparingly, enhancing rather than distracting from the purity of movement. One of the most admired aspects of geisha dance was its ability to embody the seasons. A spring dance might show the blossoming of flowers, each movement delicate and unfolding. A summer dance could evoke the buzzing of cicadas or the glow of lanterns at evening festivals. Autumn brought gestures that suggested falling leaves, while winter dances moved with the quiet stillness of snow. In this way, the geisha's body became a reflection of the natural world, her movements attuned to the cycles of time that shaped Japanese life. Poetry and conversation interwove seamlessly with music and dance. A geisha was expected to compose short verses, often in the form of haiku, that captured the mood of an evening or the beauty of a fleeting moment. These verses were recited during banquets, their brevity and resonance enhancing the sense of impermanence. Guests treasured these poetic exchanges, often recording them in journals or retelling them in gatherings, ensuring that the memory of a single evening lived on in words as well as in feeling. Conversation itself was an art no less important than music or dance. A geisha's wit and intelligence were tools as refined as her shamisen. She guided discussions with lightness, balancing humor and insight, ensuring that every guest felt included. She could flatter without insincerity, tease without offense, and offer wisdom without presumption. This art of dialogue distinguished the geisha from other entertainers, elevating her role from performer to companion, from ornament to equal participant in the shared creation of atmosphere. The tea ceremony also occupied a place within the geisha's repertoire. Though the most formalized expressions of the ceremony were associated with tea masters and temples, geisha brought elements of this ritual into their performances. The slow preparation of tea, the careful pouring, the quiet gestures of offering, all conveyed mindfulness, harmony, and respect. For guests, these moments provided a pause in the evening's flow, a reminder of the balance between movement and stillness, laughter and silence. Each of these arts, music, dance, poetry, conversation, and ritual, was powerful on its own, but their true strength lay in their integration. A geisha did not perform them in isolation. Rather, she wove them together into an atmosphere, shaping the evening as a living work of art. A song flowed into a dance ended with a poem sparked laughter and conversation returned to music. The transitions were seamless, creating an experience where no single element dominated, but all combined into a harmony of presence. What made this artistry so profound was its impermanence. No two evenings were the same. No performance could ever be repeated exactly. The music, the dance, the poetry, the laughter, all existed only in that moment, dissolving as soon as they were experienced. Guests left with memories rather than artifacts, carrying in their hearts the fleeting beauty of an evening that could never return. This impermanence was not a limitation, but the very essence of geisha art, aligning it with the deepest currents of Japanese philosophy. The refinement of these arts during the Golden Age elevated geisha culture into something more than entertainment. They became custodians of traditions that might otherwise have been lost, preserving songs, dances, and rituals that bridged centuries. They carried forward not only the elegance of the floating world, but the soul of Japanese aesthetics. In doing so, they ensured that their art would endure, even as the society around them faced the storms of change. The brilliance of the Golden Age lay in this integration of fragility and resilience. The geisha's art was fragile, existing only in fleeting moments, dependent on the moods of guests, the glow of lanterns, the turning of seasons. Yet it was also resilient, carried forward by discipline, preserved in memory, and sustained through generations. In this paradox lay the enduring power of geisha art, a power that still resonates today in the lanes of Kyoto's Gion and the stories told of evenings long past. The Golden Age of geisha was not only a triumph of art and atmosphere, but also an era in which they defined the very standards of beauty in Japan. Their presence in the floating world made them the arbiters of fashion, the trendsetters whose choices in kimono, hairstyle, and cosmetics echoed far beyond the tea houses of Kyoto and Edo. In the lantern-lit alleys of Gion, in the prints sold in bustling markets, and in the whispered conversations of townspeople, the geisha set the tone for what it meant to be elegant, refined, and desirable. Kimono were central to this influence. A geisha's attire was more than clothing. It was a living canvas of art and seasonality. The choice of color, pattern, and fabric conveyed meaning, reflecting both the time of year and the subtle messages of refinement. In spring, pale pinks and soft greens evoked cherry blossoms and new growth. In summer, lighter fabrics and designs of flowing water offered coolness against the heat. Autumn brought deep reds and golds, echoing falling leaves. Winter revealed silks of snowy white or pine green, suggesting stillness and endurance. Guests admired not only the artistry of the garments, but also the awareness of seasonal harmony they displayed. These choices filtered into broader society. Townspeople, unable to afford the lavish silks of the geisha, imitated their styles in humbler fabrics, adopting patterns and colors that echoed the elegance they saw in prints and festivals. Merchants sought to dress their wives and daughters in fashions that mirrored the geisha's aesthetic, and kimono makers tailored their designs to the demand created by geisha influence. In this way, the floating world set trends that rippled outward, shaping the appearance of entire communities. Hairstyles carried similar weight. The elaborate coiffures of geisha and maiko required hours of preparation, with pins, combs, and ornaments carefully arranged to signal both status and season. A young maiko's hair glittered with vibrant decorations, cherry blossoms in spring, fireflies in summer, chrysanthemums in autumn, while a senior geisha wore more subdued styles, reflecting maturity and refinement. These hairstyles were not only admired, but emulated. Women across Japan adopted simplified versions, inspired by the beauty they saw in prints and in the occasional glimpses of geisha during festivals. Cosmetics, too, bore the mark of geisha influence. The iconic white base, the carefully painted red lips, the subtle shading of the eyes, all became symbols of elegance. Though ordinary women did not often replicate the full makeup of the geisha, they drew inspiration from its principles: clarity of skin, subtle contrasts, the suggestion of refinement through restraint. In a society that valued suggestion over spectacle, the geisha's makeup set the standard for how beauty was understood and expressed. The influence of geisha extended beyond appearance into demeanor. Their posture, their way of walking, their gestures, all were observed and admired. A geisha's slow, deliberate movements, her graceful bow, her careful arrangement of sleeves, embodied ideals of elegance that women across society sought to imitate. Even men absorbed these standards, adjusting their own manners to align with the refinement they witnessed in the company of geisha. Ukiyo-e prints amplified this influence. Artists like Utamaro captured geisha in moments of quiet grace, adjusting a hairpin, gazing into the distance, pouring sake with delicate care. These prints circulated widely, shaping public perception of beauty. For many who'd never encountered a geisha in person, these images defined their ideals, creating a shared cultural vision of refinement rooted in the floating world. The standards of beauty set by geisha were not static. They evolved with the times. As fabrics, dyes, and accessories changed, so too did the fashions of the geisha, ensuring that their influence remained fresh. Their adaptability allowed them to remain relevant, guiding taste in ways that bridged tradition and novelty. Patrons admired not only their elegance, but their ability to embody the spirit of the age, while remaining anchored in timeless refinement. This role as arbiters of beauty was not without pressure. Every appearance carried expectations, for a geisha was judged not only by her art, but by her presentation. A poorly chosen kimono, an unpolished gesture, a careless application of makeup. Any of these could damage her reputation. The standards she set for society were the same standards against which she herself was measured, creating a cycle of pressure and influence that demanded constant vigilance. Yet for many geisha, this role brought pride as well as burden. To define the ideals of beauty was to shape the cultural imagination of the nation, to embody values larger than oneself. Their influence reached beyond the floating world, shaping weddings, festivals, and everyday fashion. They were not only entertainers, but teachers of refinement. Their presence reminding all who saw them of the harmony between art, season, and self. The golden age of geisha was thus not confined to music, dance, and conversation. It was also a golden age of beauty and fashion, a time when the choices of geisha defined the aesthetic standards of Japan. Their kimonos set trends, their hairstyles shaped ideals, their gestures taught grace. In their appearance as much as in their art, they embodied the fleeting brilliance of impermanence, reminding society that beauty was not only to be admired, but to be lived. And so, as lanterns glowed in the narrow lanes of Kyoto, as prints circulated in bustling Edo, as whispers of fashion spread through markets and households, the influence of the geisha extended into every corner of society. They were the blossoms of refinement, the arbiters of taste, the living symbols of an age that found its identity in the harmony of art and impermanence. The golden age of the geisha was not only a period when they entertained merchants, samurai, and politicians. It was also the era when they became muses. Figures whose presence and artistry inspired some of the most enduring works of Japanese art and literature. In the narrow alleys of Kyoto's Gion, in the tea houses of Edo's Shinbashi, and in the bustling centers of Osaka, geisha were not merely performers, but living embodiments of aesthetic ideals that painters, poets, and writers sought to capture. Ukiyo artists were among the first to elevate geisha into cultural icons. By the early 19th century, woodblock prints of geisha circulated widely, often depicting them in moments of quiet elegance, adjusting a sleeve, gazing into a mirror, or pausing mid-dance. These images distilled the essence of geisha artistry into a single frame, emphasizing not spectacle, but refinement. Artists such as Utamaro became famous for capturing the delicate beauty of geisha, their subtle expressions and poised gestures. For many people across Japan, especially those who never had direct contact with geisha, these prints defined what grace and refinement looked like. Poets, too, found inspiration in the world of the seisha. Their verses often celebrated evenings spent in ozashiki banquets, where laughter mixed with the sound of shamisen and the scent of incense drifted through the air. A simple gesture, a fan unfolding, a sleeve brushing the tatami, a cup of sake offered with a smile, could inspire a haiku that captured the fleeting beauty of the moment. These poems, like the geisha themselves, embodied mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. The presence of geisha was a reminder that beauty was not eternal, but its very transience gave it meaning. Writers incorporated geisha into stories and plays, often portraying them as figures of wisdom, wit, and melancholy. Unlike courtesans, whose role in literature was frequently tied to sensuality and commerce, geisha were depicted as companions of the mind and spirit. They were confidants, conversationalists, and at times, tragic figures whose lives reflected the struggles of impermanence. These portrayals reinforced the distinction between geisha and other women of the floating world, establishing them as symbols of cultural depth rather than indulgence. Kabuki theater, which flourished during this time, often featured characters modeled on geisha. These roles emphasized elegance, restraint, and the subtle art of presence. Audiences recognized in these portrayals not only the beauty of geisha, but also the ideals of refinement and impermanence that they represented. In this way, geisha influenced not only the visual and literary arts, but also the performing arts, their image shaping how entire audiences understood beauty. The relationship between geisha and artists was not one-sided. Geisha themselves were often patrons of art, commissioning works or preserving traditions through performance. A celebrated geisha might inspire multiple portraits, her likeness appearing in prints, her name whispered in poems. At the same time, she contributed to the survival of artistic traditions, ensuring that dances, songs, and rituals were performed and remembered. The exchange between geisha and artists created a cycle of inspiration, each reinforcing the other's presence in cultural memory. This mutual influence extended into philosophy. Thinkers of the time often reflected on the geisha as living embodiments of impermanence. They noted how her presence transformed an evening into a work of art, how her laughter and music created an atmosphere that could never be repeated. For philosophers attuned to the ideals of mono no aware and wabi-sabi, the geisha represented the perfect union of beauty and transience, refinement and simplicity, presence and impermanence. Foreign visitors who encountered geisha during the late 19th century were struck by this connection between art and life. Many described them not merely as entertainers, but as cultural icons, their presence embodying the values of Japan itself. Writers from abroad, unfamiliar with the subtleties of geisha art, often misunderstood their role. Yet even in misunderstanding, they recognized the aesthetic depth of their presence. For Japan, this foreign fascination only reinforced the symbolic weight of the geisha, transforming them into ambassadors of cultural identity. Yet behind this symbolic role lay the reality of individual lives. A geisha might inspire poems and prints, yet she still carried debts, endured discipline, and faced the limitations of her profession. The gap between the idealized image in art and the lived experience of geisha was vast, a paradox that defined their existence. Artists celebrated them as muses, but few depicted their struggles. The exhaustion of long nights, the burden of financial obligations, the sacrifices of personal freedom. This tension between image and reality added poignancy to their role as muses, for their beauty was not effortless, but hard-won. Still, many geisha took pride in their role as cultural symbols. To be immortalized in a print or poem was to achieve a form of permanence that contrasted with the fleeting nature of their daily lives. Their names might fade, but their images endured, carried across generations as representations of refinement. In this way, the geisha transcended the impermanence of individual existence, achieving a form of immortality through art. The golden age of geisha was thus not only an era of performance, but an era of inspiration. Painters, poets, writers, and philosophers all turned to them as muses, finding in their presence the essence of beauty and impermanence. The geisha did not merely preserve tradition. They became tradition, woven into the cultural imagination of Japan. Their laughter, their music, their gestures were preserved not only in memory, but in art, ensuring that their influence would endure long after the lanterns of the floating world were extinguished. By the mid-19th century, the serene world of the geisha stood at the threshold of unprecedented change. For over a century, they had reigned as artists of refinement, guardians of atmosphere, and symbols of impermanence. Yet beyond the lantern-lit alleys of Kyoto and Edo, the nation of Japan was beginning to tremble. Foreign ships had arrived on its shores, their black smoke curling against the horizon, heralding the end of isolation. The Tokugawa shogunate wavered, and whispers of reform, modernization, and Western influence filled the air. For the geisha, this moment was both a threat and an opportunity. Their profession had always depended on tradition, on the continuity of rituals and the preservation of refinement. But it had also thrived on adaptability, on the ability to adjust to changing tastes, to absorb novelty while maintaining essence. In the decades that followed, this adaptability would be tested as never before. The presence of Westerners in Japan introduced new dynamics into the floating world. Foreign envoys, merchants, and adventurers often sought encounters with geisha. Curious about these women, whose elegance and mystery had already been depicted in prints and stories. To these outsiders, geisha appeared as emblems of Japan itself, exotic, refined, and enigmatic. Yet misunderstandings were common. Many equated them with courtesans, failing to grasp the distinction between intimacy and art. Geisha found themselves navigating not only cultural expectations at home, but also perceptions from abroad. Some geisha embraced these encounters, adapting elements of Western fashion or incorporating snippets of foreign music into their repertoire. Others resisted, determined to preserve the purity of their traditions against the tide of change. Both approaches reflected the same underlying truth. The geisha's survival depended on her ability to embody continuity while absorbing transformation. Within Japanese society, the arrival of modernization reshaped the context of geisha life. The fall of the shogunate and the rise of the Meiji era brought sweeping reforms, political, social, and cultural. Samurai lost their privileges, merchants gained influence, new industries emerged, and Western ideas of progress spread rapidly. Amid this upheaval, the geisha became a paradox, a figure rooted in the past, yet also a symbol of identity in a rapidly changing present. For many Japanese, the geisha came to represent continuity. As the nation adopted Western clothing, Western schools, Western technologies, the geisha's kimono, shamisen, and dances stood as living reminders of what was distinctly Japanese. They embodied traditions that modernization could not erase, offering reassurance that amid transformation, the soul of Japan endured. This symbolic role was reinforced by their visibility. Geisha continued to appear in festivals, prints, and stories. Their presence celebrated not only by patrons, but by a public anxious about the loss of tradition. In a society caught between admiration for the West and fear of cultural erasure, the geisha's refinement became a form of resistance, a statement that beauty rooted in impermanence could withstand the march of progress. Yet modernization also created challenges. The rigid apprenticeship system, with its debts and obligations, came under scrutiny in an era that increasingly valued education and individual freedom. Some argued that the ukiyo system was outdated, a relic of feudalism. The cost of kimono and training became harder to sustain as economic structures shifted. The decline of the courtesan profession, once rivals to the geisha, removed one source of competition, but also highlighted the fragility of occupations rooted in the floating world. Despite these pressures, Geisha adapted with remarkable resilience. Many began to emphasize their role as cultural preservers, framing their art not merely as entertainment, but as heritage. Dance schools formalized, shamisen traditions were codified, and performances were increasingly presented as expressions of national culture rather than fleeting amusements. In this way, geisha positioned themselves not only as participants in the floating world, but as guardians of Japan's identity in an age of transformation. The interplay between old and new could even be seen in their attire. While geisha continued to wear kimono, some subtly incorporated Western fabrics or colors, blending tradition with novelty. Hairstyles too shifted, influenced by changing fashions yet retaining the distinctive ornaments that marked their profession. These adaptations reflected the balance they had always maintained, absorbing change without abandoning essence. For the geisha themselves, this era was one of uncertainty. The debts and demands of the ukiyo remained, but the social landscape around them shifted rapidly. Patrons, once drawn from samurai and wealthy merchants, now included industrialists, officials, and even Westerners. The dynamics of power changed, and with them, the nature of patronage. Some geisha thrived in this new environment, securing prestigious patrons and adapting their art to modern tastes. Others struggled, caught between tradition and transformation, unable to find their footing in a world where values shifted daily. Yet through it all, the geisha's art endured. The shamisen still sang in lantern-lit rooms, dances still unfolded with elegance, laughter still filled the air of ozashiki banquets. The impermanence that had always defined their art became a source of strength, reminding both geisha and guests that beauty was not meant to resist change, but to exist within it, fleeting yet profound. The golden age of geisha thus extended into the threshold of modernity. It was an age not only of flourishing art, but of resilience. An age when geisha became both symbols of tradition and participants in transformation. Their presence reassured a nation in flux. Their refinement offered continuity amid disruption. Their impermanence taught the enduring lesson that beauty need not be permanent to matter. And so, as Japan entered the Meiji era, the geisha walked beside it, not untouched by change, but unbroken, carrying forward the values of refinement, grace, and impermanence into a world that would never again be the same. Thank you, dear listener, for accompanying me through this second chapter of our journey into the hidden world of the geisha. In this part, we have seen how discipline shaped their daily lives, how rules guided their art, and how tradition became the foundation of their quiet strength. But our journey does not end here. In the next part, we will move even further, exploring the deeper layers of their artistry, their philosophy, and the floating world that defined generations of Japanese culture. If this story has brought you calm or inspiration, please let me know in the comments. Share where in the world you are listening from, and tell me what time it is right now as you reach the end of this chapter. And don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the next steps of this long and gentle journey. Until we meet again, may your nights be peaceful, your dreams gentle, and your heart touched by quiet beauty.